Previously on Systematic Theology 2. And now the exciting conclusion of Ecclesiology, Part 7, the Church in Israel. We pick up here with what is, in all likelihood, a far more complicated conversation than we can go into at the moment. So I just want to sketch certain parameters here, and I'm narrowing the focus here to the kinds of conversations that are prominent among Protestants and evangelicals. And so broadly speaking, at least from a Moody perspective, we can divide things into the non-dispensationalists versus, of course, the dispensationalists. Now again, it's not so easy. As you'll see in a moment, there's nuance here that doesn't even make for a clear definition of any of them. And even the non-dispensationalists, what we're mainly talking about here is covenant theology, which itself is not just one thing. There's variety, there's difference. There's Old Covenant sorts of people, the classical covenantalists. There's more New Covenant sorts of people that are growing in popularity today that range from Nick Perrin, the president of Trinity, to Doug Moo, who you guys all probably know, Henri Blocher, the prominent French theologian. And then you've got whatever you want to call the covenant sort of movement that happens through N.T. Wright's theology, the New Perspective, which has its own overlaps, right? So Nick Perrin would be closer to the New Perspective, Henri Blocher would not, and yet they both can fit within this broader New Covenant sort of perspective. The issues are complicated. Just know that. Moody, of course, is a dispensational school, so I want to just give you a larger taxonomy here of what's going on in dispensational perspective. So, beginning with the non-dispensationalists, again, I said that primarily who we're going to talk about is covenant theology, but you shouldn't see covenant theology as the only non-dispensationalists. Catholics have their own version of what you could call a covenant-based theology, but it's very different from what we think of as covenant theology. Similarly, the Eastern Orthodox Church wouldn't fit really into either economy, and never mind the various people in the largely variegated spectrum today. You'd say, well, I don't really fit precisely under either one. So, largely speaking, as a larger group, basically speaking, what we mean by covenantalism is something that's especially lending to Galatians 5:15-16. This is the primary passage. 15-16. Which refers to New Testament believers apparently as the Israel of God, right? Making this distinction between the children of Sarah and the children of Hagar, and the ones that you might think of as biological descendants of Sarah, or actually descendants of Hagar in the way that Paul describes it there, and those who you might think of as children of Hagar are actually children of Sarah. Now, I'd want to suggest that it's bigger than biology, and I'll get to this in a moment. Because even when you think of that passage, the people that you think of as naturally children of Hagar are in no sense being described there in ways that are limited to biological children of Hagar. You're talking about Gentiles in general. And of course, under no biblical account do all Gentiles proceed from Hagar. So it's not really limited to a biological claim. But in the modern sector, we do tend to think in terms of biology, and Galatians 5 becomes that linchpin of importance for, broadly speaking, a covenantal theology. Now, classical covenantal theologians have sometimes been called adherents of replacement theology, so they're replacing Israel. Classical covenantal theologians don't like this. They would object to this designation. They would argue that they aren't contending that they replace Israel, so much as the Old Covenant was always meant to make way for the culmination of Israel in Christ. The church then lives in the life of Christ, receiving the benefits of the promise to Israel, by extension through the church's identity in the Christ who receives the benefits. So ultimately what folks that would articulate it this way are trying to say is that they're not wanting to say that the church replaces Israel so much as Israel has reached its completion and it's done. Someone like Oliver O'Donovan seems to talk this way, prominent theological ethicist in the UK, older fellow. One of my good friends from my PhD days, he would really take exception if someone would say that he adheres to replacement theology, and this is the way he defined himself. The key here, though, is to say that they don't see a stark difference between Israel theologically and the church. The church in many ways takes on the promises of Israel as the fulfillment of the promises of Israel, precisely because as the Israel of God, according to Galatians 5, it now receives those promises unto itself. So Israel as ethnic identity biologically descended from Abraham ceases to be an ongoing people of God on account of its ethnicity. Put that in contrast to classical dispensationalists. There aren't really a lot of classical dispensationalists around. Now, you'll find some in terms of older pastors, even some of their progeny, their theological progeny that aren't really necessarily trained. You're not going to go to the seminaries, even the great dispensational schools like Dallas Theological Seminary. You're not really going to find classical dispensationalists there. This group argues that there are two separate people of God. There's a stark division. There's the Israel of God, and then there's the church of God. The church, and this is what's the bigger distinction of classical dispensationalism, the church is a parenthesis. It is a parenthesis not revealed in the Old Testament. So there's no indication that there's going to be a group that we think of as the church. Classical dispensationalists would see 7 dispensations, and these dispensations are marked by periods that begin with some sort of promise, they end with some sort of calamity and judgment. So there are 7 of these. There's original creation, which begins obviously with the promise of life around the ordering of reality around the tree of life, and it ends with the calamity of sin falling away and the judgment of being cast out. The second dispensation would be that period that culminates in the flood. So the promise seems to be indicated in the promise that there will be a descendant from the woman who will crush the serpent's head. But it ends in calamity, with people being as bad as they could be, apparently, and God repenting that he ever created, and then the judgment is the flood. The third dispensation is the Noahic covenant. So this is the covenant given to Noah, symbolized in the rainbow. And this one ends in the calamity of building of the Tower of Babel, with the judgment of the dispersing of the nations. The fourth dispensation is Israel. This is a covenant with Abraham that brings forth the nation of Israel, and it culminates in the calamity of Israel rejecting its Messiah and the judgment of being sent into diaspora, a final diaspora which they live in today. The fifth dispensation is the church age, and this is the parenthesis. This is the one that was never really known about and revealed, and this is a promise given to those who have faith in Christ, and its culmination comes ultimately in a judgment that's not actually upon the church. The church is removed in this event known as the rapture, and that becomes a time of tribulation for the nation of Israel to judge them for their disobedience and their refusal to believe. And that calamity just is also the judgment. The sixth dispensation is the millennial kingdom, which is supposed to be all about Israel. The church is not involved in this, but it's not the perfect eternal state yet. It's those who've made it through the tribulation. And so the culmination of this is the calamity of people rising up in some amount of, in some size, to push against God. And in pushing against God, there's the judgment upon them, and the judgment is symbolized by the casting of people into the lake of fire that don't believe, and the great white throne judgment. And then the seventh dispensation is the final one. This is the eternal state, and it does not end in calamity and judgment. It's what opens up into eternity. It is a period of ongoing separation for Israel and the church, though. Israel reigns with Christ on earth. The fate of the church is unknown. Again, this group doesn't really exist anymore. Second, we have revised classical dispensationalism. Now, this is the one that if you hear people who say that they are classical dispensationalists, they're probably revised. Now, this group is not as comfortable, they'll hold on to the 7 dispensations, they're not quite as comfortable with calling the church a parenthesis. They will still say that the church and Israel are 2 separate peoples of God. However, they're going to say that the church was always still ultimately a plan, that there would be a church. And so it wasn't as if this was just an act undertaken by God that wasn't previously at least recorded and mentioned and foreshadowed. This is a group that God always, this was a mystery that was hidden, and it was a hidden form of redemption for Gentiles. And so once the age of the Gentiles is done, then you get back into dealing with Israel. Guys like Charles Ryrie are this. Some of our professors at Moody are this as well. Then you have a really vague group called progressive dispensationalists. In fact, I've known of at least one revised classical dispensationalist who said that he calls himself revised classical because progressive dispensationalism isn't really clearly demarcated. Some people actually like that it's not clearly demarcated, but the main proponent of this is a guy named Darrell Bach who teaches at Dallas. He's the guy who really opens up into this, but it creates a lot of differences. And what progressive dispensationalism says, it wants to relax this distinction between Israel and the church. It's still saying that there's Israel and that the church is not Israel, but it's not as if these are two eternal groups that are meant to always be apart from each other. The church is not a parenthesis, the millennial reign is not just for Israel, and the eternal state is certainly not just Jesus Christ on the Davidic throne with Israel and the churches who knows where, right? Eventually they join together, still distinct in their identification, but one as a people of God, worshiping God together in Christ for eternity. And then you have other sorts of things that are eschatologically driven, that are different about just progressive dispensationalists, but the key here is that both Israel and the church have their place in the promises to the extent that they are grafted into Christ. Okay, that's a lot. I'm just trying to sketch it here. Now, what I want to say is the bigger issue. In my view, the bigger issue is that of supersessionism. This is the view that Israel is ultimately superseded and the church takes over everything that belongs to it. Often attributed to covenant folks, but I would argue is actually true in some sense, at least in the way that it's articulated, of traditional covenant theology and dispensationalist theology. And this is something that some progressives move beyond and some new covenant folks move beyond. In this case, supersessionism is a division. It states that a division is formed between Jewish theological and ethnic identity. So you have Jewishness that can be divided between theological Jewishness and ethnic Jewishness. For covenantalism and other such overt supersessionist formulations, and I mean classical covenantalism, the church takes on the theological blessings of Israel, even becoming theological Israel, while biological Israel remains ethnic Israel. So you have the church is theological Israel, and they're the ethnic Israelites, or the Jews, who stay around because God is either using them as an example to show people what happens when you reject him, or they're just persisting, or whatever. Galatians again becomes a powerful proof text here as evidence of the split of the theological from the ethnic. Traditional forms of dispensationalism, I think, also reify the divide between theology and ethnicity by affirming that ethnic Israel remains the theological heir of the promises of Abraham on account of biological descent. Romans 11 becomes a main passage of appeal here again. What I would want to argue is that biblical Israel, and this is a term that's used as a technical one in the literature, so I want to quote that up there, is covenantal in character, meaning it is neither reducible to theological nor ethnic as opposed to each other. It is covenantal in character, which could never reduce identity to biology. There is no discernible ethnic character for Israel per se. First, ethnicity is a modern category that owes more to reification of the category of race than anything else. So see Matthew Fry Jacobson's highly regarded history titled Whiteness of a Different Color. He does a good job of showing that in the third part of his endeavor. Second, the Old Testament goes out of its way to delineate a covenantal character that cannot be reduced to biology. For example, Isaac is in, Ishmael is out, Jacob in, Esau out. Benjamin is functionally cut off for a while, subsisting only at the end of Judges due to mixture with other tribes. The 10 northern tribes are eventually washed away. Romans finally reduces the notion of seed to Jesus. Romans 11 then affirms that to be anything with respect to God and new creation is to be grafted into Christ. Peter affirms this in Acts 15. Furthermore, even non-biological descendants of Israel are constantly entering into the covenant. There's provision made for this in the Torah. And then see people like Moses' wife, Rahab, Ruth, Caleb. Even Jesus himself, if you look at the genealogies in Matthew and Luke, is not identified as a biological descendant. Instead, he's identified as the son of Mary, who is the wife of Joseph, who is the biological descendant of Abraham. So, not so simple to speak in terms of biology, and I'd argue that's not the biblical thrust.